That's Nebraska head football coach Matt Rule after Nebraska's 21-17 loss to USC, a game which completely flipped when quarterback Dylan Raiola exited the game in the third quarter. As Dylan was holding his ankle, he was down on the turf for about a minute and a half. Then he was helped up. He hobbled off of the field with one arm around his head coach, the other arm around one of the Nebraska trainers. And even when he was being assisted off the field, Dylan Raiola was trying so hard to put the weight needed on that right foot to find out if he could be okay. And even after he went into the tent, was treated, he never took his pads off, never took his uniform off, and it seemed he had a spirit about him, like he really just wanted to be back on the field. However, as you just heard the head coach say, it wasn't the right thing to do because Dylan can't run. And even during the fourth quarter light show, Dylan moved very slowly just to get onto the field, and there were times when he was standing on the sideline, you could tell he was putting a little bit of pressure on his right foot just to try to see, can he plant, could he move, not at the level he needs to run Nebraska's offense, but maybe like at the level he wants and slightly below. The answer was no. Coaching staff decides to remain cautious and turn the game over to freshman quarterback TJ Lateef, and it results in a loss. Not to say that's the sole reason why Nebraska lost, Chase, but certainly did not help the Huskers' cause, as there's a quarterback change in the middle of this game, and that all coincided with USC seizing control. And if you only watched the first half and the first, 8 minutes of the third quarter, you thought things were looking really good for Nebraska, but that's not the ultimate result and feeling for Husker fans. 21-17 USC wins it.
Yeah, Kevin, a Compton, California native and TJ Lateef coming into his biggest moment by far in his freshman season. As you just mentioned, Rule's comments after the game, it was his decision to keep Raiola off the field and go with Lateef for the remainder of the game. He called the performance admirable, but he also said that, over 200 yards rushing allowed, USC on the ground, just was beyond the quarterback and beyond the injury in the third quarter. Just what was your take in the second half where USC had big chunk plays and were able to come back and score even when Nebraska had multiple leads and they took their first lead of the game with less than 10 minutes to play?
Yeah, Chase, I like your term there, chunk plays, because I think one of those was maybe the biggest moment outside of the Raiola injury in this game, and that's when they ran a flea flicker. USC was effective running the football, and they were getting 8 yards a pop, 10 yards a pop. It looked like they were going to run it, and then the running back flipped it back to Jaden Maiava, and he went downfield. It was a 40-plus yard gain, and it moved USC from their own territory into Nebraska territory. A few plays later, there was a controversial call that the fans here did not like, but it gave USC more yardage, and this all came after Nebraska took a 17-14 lead, and the Trojans punched right back. And so the fact that they had the big play on the flea flicker, they had the penalty on Nebraska, which got them into the red zone. They score a few plays later, and once USC had the lead, as we talked about earlier, once the Trojans were in front for the first time, knowing Nebraska was dealing with a freshman quarterback on this big of a stage, that's when just the overall vibe of this game completely shifted. But yeah, those chunk plays were pretty big for USC, and surprisingly, I think a lot of fans thought those would have come through the air. Maiava wasn't sensational tonight. If you think back about 4 weeks ago, he was in the Heisman discussion. He was underthrowing receivers. He wasn't comfortable. Nebraska was getting good pressure on the USC quarterback. But at the end, he finishes 9 of 23 for 135 yards. So the Huskers did what they needed to against Maiava. It's just the Trojans pivoted to running the football really effectively, and that allowed them to sustain drives, and especially on the big one in which they took the lead. They had some gashing runs there right through the teeth of Nebraska's defense. So chunk plays, good term, Chase.
Yeah, Kevin, John Butler's secondary defense was on display tonight. Andrew Marshall had an interception. Donovan Jones with a pass breakup. But you're right, USC found a success on the ground. King Miller had a big day, scoring the go-ahead touchdown as well. The final question, you talked about the vibe changing in the third quarter, but beyond the injury and beyond the outcome of the game, I think a lot of the fans are going to remember the atmosphere tonight. from your perspective on the 7th floor at Memorial Stadium, just the overall blackout, your thoughts? It felt like the Husker Nation bought into wearing black, and just what an environment it was down the stretch there in Lincoln.
Yeah, and I think that's what makes this outcome so sour for Husker fans, because it had all the makings of being one of those nights that you will talk about for years to come. And maybe fans will still do that. It's just they're not going to want to talk about the fourth quarter and what the outcome was. It was incredible. You know, this is something not very Nebraska-like, if you may, because Nebraska tends to hang its hat on tradition, and they don't like to get too far off the grid. But they went with the alternate uniforms, black tops, black bottoms, and they painted this turf black, the midfield logo, the block in, and then they painted the end zones. And I was told they used over 60,000 gallons of paint to make sure it was as black can be. And all the fans, you only saw a couple specks of red, and this is known as the Sea of Red. Tonight it was the Sea of Black. There were the black balloons, and even Nebraska changed the song in which it entered the field through the tunnel walk. It wasn't serious tonight. Instead, they used Back in Black. So it was at every turn, you were smacked in the face with the blackness of this game. And unfortunately, it's a dark result for the Huskers because they lose the game after being in control, having the lead at halftime, having a 17-14 lead in the second half, but they walk away from this one with USC winning it 21-17. But Chase, it was fun, and this is something that I think a lot of fans are going to think fondly about in terms of the experience. A lot of folks want to compare it to the Colorado game last year. I think the energy was on a similar level. In my opinion, I feel like the Colorado game was a little bit more vibrant and a little bit louder. This was just a little more unique, and it was a lot of fun. And I think a lot of folks enjoyed seeing the black on black and seeing a different turf. I don't know that they'll want to do it every year, though.
Yeah, an incredible spectacle, but not an incredible result from Husker fans. Thank you, Kevin, for your reports from Memorial Stadium. Nebraska, as I mentioned earlier, now 0-8 against ranked opponents in the Matt Rule era here at Nebraska. You're looking at the game stats, fairly comparable except for on the ground. Nebraska's defense gashed for 202 yards. Not a good result. Through the air, as Kevin just mentioned, Jaden Mayava, not a very successful day. The black shirt secondary was impressive, and those Raiola stats are only from about 2.5 quarters of play before he went out with an ankle injury. For the remainder of the game, it was TJ Lateef. On the ground for the Huskers, Emmett Johnson, another huge performance with 165 yards, but you can see 3 Trojan helmets on that graphic. King Miller with 129 rushing yards there, and that actually should be, I believe, TJ Lateef, 6 for 18 on the ground. Overall, Nebraska falls to USC 21-17. Emmett Johnson falling short on 4th down. A blackout successful in terms of fan experience, but not successful in the win column.